Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest live episode of The Free Marketeers. The topic of today's show unfortunately died a very sudden death in about 48 hours, but we're still going to analyze it, I think, hopefully to a lot of value and a lot of worth to those of you who are interested in this particular topic. Today, we're talking about the Super League, or in some circles, the European Super League. And to help me analyze this topic, I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Steve Davies, from the Institute of Economic Affairs in the UK. Steve, how are you? And thank you for being here.
I'm great, and thanks very much for having me on the show.
No, it's a pleasure. When I scheduled the episode, I think on Monday or Tuesday this week, because we're recording on Thursday, the 22nd of April, I thought, this now the landscape of football has forever changed as we know it. Obviously, I'm in South Africa. A lot of fans here of the Barclays Premier League, of all the sort of big teams, I guess the big six as they are known, maybe some of the smaller teams here and there, but mostly the big six. And then we had on Sunday night this announcement that a new Super League was going to start with 15 teams guaranteed their spots and 5 others by invitation. Now, those 15 guarantees would have been teams in England, such as Manchester City, Manchester United, Chelsea, Liverpool, Arsenal, Tottenham Hotspur. We had the Milan clubs, AC and Inter. We had Real Madrid and Barcelona. And of course, there were rumors going around that they tried to get Bayern Munich and PSG involved, but due to ownership structures and that kind of thing, they couldn't. So I could go on and on about this, but the most important thing is getting your analysis, because of course you wrote an article on this for the IEA. I have linked to that in the show notes for those of you who want to read the article itself. But just to start off with, I suppose you saw this thing coming from a while ago.
Well, as I say in the start of my article, you have to be living under a rock on Mars for the last 20 years to not have seen something like this coming. There have been repeated rumors pretty much every year, actually, certainly every time the Champions League structure is up for discussion, that something like this was going to happen, usually started by two of the players in this time, clubs in Serie A in Italy, particularly Juventus, and the two big clubs in Spain, Barcelona and Real Madrid. But previously, this has always been used as a bargaining tool in order to extract concessions from the regulator, from UEFA. And what has happened this time is it's actually gone ahead, although I have to say in a monumentally incompetent and cack-handed fashion. I mean, you do have to wonder how on earth any of these people managed to run a successful business, or in the case of Florentino Perez and Giovanni Agnelli, an unsuccessful business, because they appear to lack elementary business, competence. But that aside, yes, it was pretty easy to see this was coming. There was something like this, I think, was bound to happen sooner or later, because there's a fundamental conflict of interest in the minds of the owners of the so-called big teams between what they see as their own interests and the way football is run even now in the major leagues and in Europe, because they see it that they bring in all the big fans, they bring in all the television revenue, but oh god damn it, they have to share all this revenue with all these pesky smaller teams, and they have to essentially put up with, particularly in the Premier League, the British Premier League, that is, the English Premier League, the prospect of not qualifying next year, because of the 6 that were going to be involved in the English case, 2 of them, Arsenal and Tottenham, you would put pretty big money, almost unlimited money in Arsenal's case, against them getting into the Champions League next year. And it's not at all certain that Liverpool are going to qualify next year. Manchester United haven't qualified within very recent memory, a couple of years ago. So that's what really, I think, was bringing this to a head. It was a conflict between the way these owners understood their role in the business to be and their concerns, not so much for maximizing profit as for having guaranteed profit. That's what this was really about.
You mentioned Florentino Perez, Agnelli at Juventus, and of course then one has the Fenway Sports Group at Liverpool, you have the Glazers at Manchester United, you have Stan Kroenke at Arsenal. So a bit of an American flavor, and not to say that this is an American-caused problem, but maybe the way that in general American sports owners. I mean, Kroenke owns not the St. Louis Rams, the LA Rams now. I think that he moved the whole team from one city to another because he thought it would be better financially. So can one say it's as simple as they thought the NFL, MLB sort of model would work with football in Europe?
Well, yes, it is. I mean, partly this reflects the parochialism of rich Americans who can't get their heads around the fact that the rest of the world is not like the United States. But also, I think it does reflect a tendency or trend, if you like, in global business, which as successful American businessmen, they're very well aware of, which they tend to see as the kind of tide of history, if you will, something that has a quality of inevitability about it. And what people like Crony and the Glazers and the FSG group and others indeed, other Americans think, is that, first of all, there's an increasing disconnect between products and physical locations. As I've said in my article, is Louis Vuitton a French company now in any meaningful sense? Not really. It's a luxury goods manufacturer that sells to a global market, happens to have a French name, but it's not really a French company in a meaningful sense now. Similarly, with sports franchises in the United States, you mentioned the LA Rams. I mean, the Las Vegas Raiders, as they are, started off in Oakland, went to Los Angeles, went back to Oakland, now they're in Las Vegas. The connection between locality and product, if you will, in the case of American sports, is extremely weak compared to what it is in Europe, where you have teams that have been in the same place for, in the case of some English teams, 120, 130 years. These are really deeply rooted institutions, I suppose a bit like college sports in the States. Now, that's a general trend in modern business, to weaken the connection between the locality and the actual product. The other thing is the globalization of business through television, particularly services, of which we're talking about here because it's part of the entertainment business. And Florentino Perez very clearly came out and said this. He said, amongst a lot of other rather insulting stuff about how the young people these days have an apparently incredibly short attention span and can't be bothered to watch more than 10 minutes of anything, embarrassing that part of the interview. He was arguing essentially that the future was not with what they rather dismissively call the legacy fans, the people like myself who physically go to games at grounds, but rather the TV watching audience in places like the Far East, West Asia, Africa, as where you are, and also Latin America, and that therefore the thing to do was to produce essentially a made-for-TV entertainment product, which will be marketed as a package to this audience. And the argument essentially is that the other consumers in the other parts of the world, what they want to see is a limited number, a fixed number of big name teams with the best players in the world playing against each other all the time. A kind of carnival, really. And he may well be right about that. That may well indeed be a product that there is a demand for. Certainly the NFL or the NBA, which are products of that kind, are very, very successful. And not only in the United States, it's worth saying. So there may well indeed be a market for that. So there was a feeling, I think, that there was a kind of, in American business circles and the business owners of these clubs, that there was a major tide, if you like, in the development of the global economy, which was pushing this particular product, professional sport, in a direction very like that of the American franchise system. And they thought this is the time to get on the boat. It happened to coincide with the self-interest of people like the Italian teams and the two big Spanish teams, because they've been unbelievably badly mismanaged financially over the last decade or so. So they have quite eye-watering debts. I mean, debts, because the sovereign state would have trouble servicing some of the debts that these guys have run up. So that they had an additional reason for doing it. And I think two of the teams, certainly Manchester City, my own team, and Chelsea, they only joined up apparently, from what we hear, this is only rumours, at the last minute. And it was due to what is these days known by the acronym of FOMO, meaning fear of missing out. A fear, and again, I think they thought this was inevitable. And that therefore best to be part of it and inside the tent than outside the tent shouting in. So I think that's what was behind this.
I'm very excited now because I didn't know this beforehand in talking to you, but I myself am a City fan. So we now have complete veto here in what we're going to talk about. I think we should just talk about Pep and his press conference where he very much pushed this line of the issues that he had with it, and I guess he spoke for a lot of fans. That sort of, and I wanted to ask you. This is tied then to. So you mentioned the disconnect between where products are produced and sort of these brands and that kind of thing, but also the idea of value subjectivity, which of course is a central feature of Austrian economics, free market thinking. You know, the value of something is sort of up to each person to determine for themselves. It's not just about the amount of labor that goes into the product. It's what the consumer and the customer is willing to pay for it, which can't necessarily be quantified on a spreadsheet.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think that press conference of Pep Guardiola's, where he, without actually coming out, he made it as clear as he possibly could that he was seriously pissed off with the fact that he'd only found out about this at the last minute, which is quite frankly disgraceful, and being hung out to dry like that, as Jurgen Klopp had been, the previous night. And also made the point that this was not sport, he said. He said a thing in which there's no risk of not qualifying is not proper sport. And now the question is this. Essentially, there's a division of opinion between him and the bulk of football fans who are very much on Pep's side and the owners. The owners think that actually there are lots of potential customers out there who don't care about sport in that sense. They basically want a form of like a spectacle, if you will, an entertainment. What Pep was arguing is that what makes sport attractive as a consumer good, what gives it that subjective value, is precisely the element of uncertainty. Now, personally, I'm totally on Pep's side. For me, part of the value of football as entertainment is precisely that crazy stuff can happen. And it is highly unpredictable. And also there is the rewards are all the sweeter because of the perils and pains of relegation and failure. And as a City fan, I've seen quite a few relegations in my time. I vividly remember the day when we got relegated to the third tier of English football because we beat Stoke by a huge margin, but two other results didn't go our way. We went down to the third division for the first time in the club's very long history. So that kind of pain, that adds to the spice, if you will, the threat that if you mess up, you're actually going to be relegated, dropped to a lower tier. That makes a lot of games much more important than they would otherwise be. And it makes success when it comes, as it has done since 2008 for City, all the sweeter because that the contrast for it. Now, I think that basically there are two different kinds of consumer out there with highly different subjective valuations of what it is they like about football. For a certain kind of fan, of whom there are undoubtedly a large number, who knows how many, it is all about seeing the best players, seeing an exhibition, if you like, of skill, certainly seeing the excitement of a game. But for a different kind of fan, the legacy fans, as they're called, the whole value of the team is about its being embedded in a league with a history and with a constantly changing cast of characters. And about the connections that are formed within that league. And it's worth saying, you talk about the Big Six. Well, at the moment, City are a Big Six team, but they weren't before 2008, very much not so. Manchester United have been, you might think, haven't they always been a top team? No, not at all. They were relegated. I can vividly remember the game when they got relegated back in the 70s. And there's been long periods in their history when they were, an important team, but certainly not one of the dominant teams. And conversely, there are teams which used to be major powers in English football, like Wolverhampton Wanderers, for example, or Everton, and not that long ago either, who are now mid-table teams at best. So that's part of the beauty of the sport for the legacy fans, is precisely the fact that your team is part of this larger system. And the key economics insight here is that it's a big, big mistake to think of football teams as being like firms. They are not firms. The firm, if you will, is the league as a whole, or even the sport as a whole. The football teams are brands. They're part of the portfolio of brands that the firm, in this case, the league, has. And to think that for traditional football fans anywhere in the world, the value that comes from your team being part of that league will be preserved if they're in a completely closed shop franchise league system of the American kind, is, I think, to misunderstand what it is that a large part of your customer base value about the product, if you will, or what the product is for them. Now, I think that what these guys thought was, these people will still buy the product, they'll still watch it on television, and we can get a whole lot of new fans in like China or Southeast Asia. That's a big gamble, I have to say, for one thing. Who knows if that would have worked out? It may well have done, but we don't know. There's always at liberty, of course, to try it, but I think it's a seriously mistaken idea.
Just on the matter of competition as a sort of motivating factor for the players themselves, and of course for adding to the spectacle of the sport. I mean, yesterday we had City going for the title, beating Aston Villa. So there's a clear incentive there to still compete for these games. They haven't won the league yet, unfortunately, and they still stress one out every freaking game they play because you just worry about them losing, as we do as City fans. But then on Monday night, we had Liverpool and Leeds. I mean, Liverpool have a chance to get into the top four. Leeds don't have that, so they don't have to be that competitive. I'm just using two examples here, but what do you think of that aspect of sort of competition, giving the players an edge? I think it was Kevin De Bruyne who posted on his Instagram or something about the value of competition in football. So then we have one example of a player saying how important it is. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on that side of it.
Yeah, well, the thing is this. If you talk to American sports fans, one of the things they most dislike about their own sports system is actually the number of games that are meaningless, that are not competitive. Games which are tanked, as they talk about it in American baseball, where there's a very large number of them. And that's because there's no either jeopardy of relegation or reward in terms of winning a title. Now, to be fair to them, the various commissioners do try to arrange the season in such a way that they minimize that. But it's very difficult not to do it. Now, the advantage of something like European football leagues is that, yes, there are certain games that are not particularly significant towards the end of the season. And those games are often rather tedious, quite frankly. But the point is that the fact that the league is very competitive and that you've got basically 7 or 8 teams fighting for 4 Champions League places at the top and about 3 to 5 teams in danger of being relegated at the bottom, sometimes even more, means that there are not that many meaningless games. But in addition, there's what you might call the burden of history. So sure, Leeds are not going to qualify for the Champions League. They're a mid-table team. They've done very well because they just got promoted. But again, they're one of the traditional big clubs. I can vividly remember when they were winning the league under Don Revie, and one of the big teams in English football, universally hated, by the way, apart from Leeds fans. And they were in the Champions League within very recent times. They're not going to, those players need no incentive in terms of winning anything to do the best they possibly can against Liverpool. It's a way of maintaining the historic memory of your team. Oh, and believe me, if it had been Manchester United, those Leeds players were playing, as they will be this coming weekend, there would have been a hell of an incentive, because that's a long-standing, bitter animosity and rivalry between those two teams. No love lost ever between United fans and Leeds United fans. There's neither of those teams is going to hold back at all in a game between those two. It's going to be seriously spiky. But that comes from the history. It comes from the long-standing rivalry that there is between the two teams. And so it's rivalries that, can survive for an amazingly long period of time. You might think this is irrational, and it is. Objectively, but it's very, very powerful. And that's what you don't get in the kind of model that the ESL was trying to create. Now, I mean, they could have made a much better job of it had they proposed a pan-European league with promotion and relegation from the national leagues. That would have been, I think, acceptable to most fans. But of course, that would have defeated the main object for most of these people, which was to have, as I said, guaranteed profits. Maybe not bigger profits. I don't think they were motivated by that, but guaranteed and certain profits. And it reflects one of the facts, unfortunately, which is that a lot of businessmen do not like competitive markets. What they want is markets where they are guaranteed to win, which of course is not the way a capitalist system works. The whole point of it is constant innovation and uncertainty. So businessmen, generally speaking, do not like capitalist free markets.
That's the perfect segue, because that's one of the main points I wanted to hit, and something I've tried to formulate in my own head in the last few days when this idea came out was around I mean, you see this in the US a lot with the quote unquote competition between the big red party and the big blue party and the apparent differences. For some of us, we see that in many ways they're very similar. You know, where it's simply a case of because the state and the economy is so mixed right now, it matters mostly who you know in power, not the actual quality of the good, the product, the service that you produce. So I mean, you have the charge now being thrown around with the Super League of see what happens when you have untrammeled capitalism, see what happens when the free market just flows. And I always want people to point me to where exactly a market is free, because we have so many regulations all around the world, never mind just in Europe. So, you know, your thoughts on that charge, I guess, of this just being greedy capitalism.
No, greed is actually not the motive for it, because if you're greedy, then you're motivated to get more and more profit. And the only way you can get more profit in a market economy is by selling more of your product to the consumers, or encouraging your consumers to pay more for it. They're being willing to pay more for it. And that means you've got to give them what they want. And I think the fundamental error that these people made was not understanding what their existing fans wanted or want, basically. But also, yes, this is not an example of untrammeled capitalism. What it is an example of is crony capitalism, if you will. And this is not just the ESL. The whole state of European football at the moment is a classic demonstration in real life of the sort of idea or notion of crony capitalism, or favor-based capitalism, if you will, where you have privately owned businesses, but they're constantly looking not to provide a better service or a better quality of administration than their competitors, but to game the system in one way or another, or to get favors from the regulators, in this case UEFA. And hence, as I said at the start of this show, for years now, the major teams, particularly the two big Spanish teams, have been trying to use UEFA to do down challenger teams like Chelsea, Manchester City, in these days Atalanta. Giovanni Agnelli actually had the sheer audacity, I suppose you've got Romaro's honesty, to come out and say that he couldn't see why Atalanta should be in the Champions League just because they happen to qualify for it. Well, what? You know, that shows you the mindset behind it. This is people who think that they have a privileged right, and that they get it by being properly connected to the rulers, if you will, in this case UEFA. So this is an example of how, if you like, oligopolistic capitalism works, where you have an oligopoly which is defined and kept in place by privilege and special contracts. Now, that's not to say there aren't problems. There is a problem, which is to do with the fact throughout football that football teams are broke, and they're broke because they typically pay more than 100% of their income in salaries to players. And you don't have to be a mathematical genius to know that that is not sustainable without constant injections of debt and or capital. Now, why do they do this? Well, it's because they're facing a collective action problem, essentially. They don't want to do this, but they will only stop doing it if they can be 100% certain that everybody else will stop doing it. Because, of course, if you stop doing it, but the other teams don't, you don't have the best players, which means you get relegated. And you might say, well, surely can't they get together and agree on binding rules that will prevent them from this destructive arms race form of competition they're in? But the problem is they're in a prisoner's dilemma, because for each individual club chairman, the ideal position to be in is that you are cheating while everyone else follows the rules. And you know that everybody else is in that position. So you have to assume that they will cheat, because if you assume they're honest and it turns out they are cheating and lying to you, which is highly credible given what we've just seen, then you will be the sucker. You will be the burglar who stays quiet while your mate goes and confesses to the police, and you end up with the 10 years in prison. He gets off scot-free. So unfortunately, because they're in a prisoner's dilemma, it's hard to see how you can get a collective agreement effective collective agreements from all the teams to solve what is the undoubted problem, which is the way the incentives lead teams to constantly spend more money than they have coming in, which is the road to ruin, unless you are fortunate enough, like City or Chelsea, to have an extremely wealthy backer and donor who's prepared to fund this for a while. Although City, to be fair, is actually self-sufficient now. It's run as a very effective profit-making business, but it took a lot of injections to get there. So that's the problem. And the question is, how do you do this? Now, I think the answer is ultimately that you have to have an outside body that basically creates the rules. What these people were trying to do was to do that, because part of the ESL proposal was actually to introduce American-style salary caps and controls on club spending, which is actually a good idea. That's what we do need. The problem was they combined it with this idea of a closed shop with no effective competition and no promotional relegation. Now, who might have an interest in sorting out this problem? Well, unfortunately, I do strongly think that governments are going to get involved, which will be a disaster, because I just do not trust the political class to not, make a mess of this or misuse it for their own ends. The other group who do have an interest, but previously have just not taken an interest in it, are the broadcasters. Because if you're the broadcaster, you're Sky Television or one of the other, ESPN or one of the other broadcasters, you want a competitive league. And you want a league with a changing cast of characters precisely because, as I said, that is what makes the league attractive. A league where the same team wins every year, like Italy, where, this year Juventus aren't going to win it, but that's the first time in 10 years, for heaven's sake. Or Germany, where Bayern win every year without fail. How is that interesting to watch? Much more interesting to have a competitive league. So it's actually in the interest of the broadcaster to have a more competitive product. And it might be that they are the outside force that can, behind the scenes anyway, get the teams to agree on a binding system of rules that will stop the incentives, to say, to try and beat the competition by spending more money than you've got.
In terms of and I want to take the opportunity to throw, it's always fun to throw jabs at Agnelli, because he thought by bringing in Ronaldo, for example, Juventus would be set on this pathway to winning the Champions League for the next 3 to 5 years. And it just shows you can't just build around one player. Maybe that was part of maybe the way in which he saw his club falling so far behind in Italy, that gave him more impetus to put pressure on other clubs to get the Super League thing off the ground. But I wanted to ask you, in terms of the UK and I guess laws and legality and that sort of thing, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, for example, he came out quite strongly on this, and I think he said something about dropping a bomb, to paraphrase a bit. But in the realm of possibility, would that be possible? For example, if Chelsea did something, it doesn't have to be just Super League focused, but if a club did something, is there space in the law in the UK for the government to step in?
No, I think that was just, if I may say so, characteristically, blowhard behaviour from the Prime Minister. It's not clear to me that the British state has power as it stands to do this. Okay. Now, what they could do, of course, is, because Parliament is sovereign, they can pass a law to give themselves power to do this if they want to. And that really would be a case of, blowing your head off to cure a headache. Essentially having the British government take over sport. I can't think of anything worse, hardly. That would be a real disaster. Having said that, there were perfectly legal sanctions at the disposal of the regulators and the organisations, the Premier League and the Football Association and UEFA. In particular, the Premier League, the members of the Premier League, the teams in it, are bound by the rules that the Premier League has, which were written when it was set up in 1992. And one of those is, I think it's Article 19, if I remember rightly, is that you cannot join or enter any competition other than I think it's 6 that the Premier League recognises. And you can only join a competition other than that with the express permission of the Premier League. So there are grounds for saying, you've decided to set up this other competition and join it. It's not one of the 6 legitimate ones. Therefore, you have broken the rules of the association that you belong to. So it would have been within the capacity of the EPL to impose pretty severe sanctions on even an extremist, to expel the teams for doing this. Personally, I think they would have had to leave, because I don't think it would have been practical to do it the way they were proposing, playing midweek and then still playing Premier League games at the weekend. I think that's a joke. That's just not practical. So there were there's. I think this was a case of politicians, in this case Boris Johnson, grandstanding and looking to ride a tide of popular sentiment by making a lot of blustery, aggressive noises. The difficulty is that it may lead to various political things going forward. And I do think actually that what this shows is it casts a light on certain things going on in politics at the moment, several of which I actually find rather disturbing, even though I'm opposed to I support the sort of fans' protest against the ESL. I have to say that some of the opposition to it has distinctly untasteful or distasteful overtones, like the opposition to foreign club ownership, which I think has in several cases a distinctly racist overtone, quite frankly. And the opposition, which is like the opposition to having foreign players in the Premier League, which I think also has had strongly racist overtones in many cases. And generally speaking, an attitude, if you like, of intense parochialism. Now, as I said, those guys thought that there was a kind of inevitable tide moving in the direction of a kind of globalized, televised sport. What this has shown is that there's nothing inevitable about that. There's also an extremely powerful backlash going on, and not just in football, a reaction against globalization and against the detachment of a lot of economic life from specific locality and identity. And this is finding expression in a number of forms of politics. Now, I have to say, the left, if you like, the socialist left, has really missed a trick in recent years. This person, Ash Sarkar, I don't even know who she is. She's this well-known left celebrity here in the UK, journalist. She tweeted on Tuesday night, why don't we see this kind of mass protest against capitalism in other areas? And I think the reason is because this protest involved an appeal, not only attacks on greed and arguments about fairness, which is fair and is kind of, you might say, left-wing rhetoric, but also appeals to tradition, identity, and history. And the contemporary socialist left in Europe and North America has moved to being actually deeply hostile to any kind of rhetoric or discussion which draws upon those ideas. And I think, thankfully, this is the case. They're missing a huge trick there. If they could combine left-wing egalitarianism with an appeal to identity and tradition, they'd be onto a winner politically. What is happening instead is that what we're seeing, I think, is the emergence of what you might call conservative anti-capitalism, which is a kind of politics, I've called it elsewhere national collectivism, and Boris Johnson is one of its contemporary exponents, which is certainly not socialist, and also, in many ways, right of centre, but which is also not free market. It's nationalist politics that emphasises local, traditional, rooted identity and is opposed to globalizing cosmopolitanism. And this finds expression in things like hostility to foreign ownership of domestic firms, hostility to immigration. And we're seeing this all over the world now. So you're seeing it in India, in Turkey, in France with Marine Le Pen, in Germany with the AfD. The list just goes on and on. In fact, it's easier to list the countries where you don't see it, really, which is basically a very short list. Japan, maybe Canada, Ireland, and Portugal. That's about it. And so I think this is another indicator of this kind of politics.
I think it might have been Roger Scruton who would have written a lot on this sort of, maybe, I mean, he was a conservative himself, of course, but a small C conservative to me, not what I had to think in terms of big R Republicans and big C conservatives in the UK.
This is very much the case, yes. I mean, Roger Scruton, who I knew slightly, I wouldn't say I knew him well, I met him a few times, but he was very much not a free market conservative. He would have been the first person to tell you that, and that was clearly the case if you look at his writings right back to when he first really burst on the scene. And although he supported the Conservative Party because he preferred it to the alternative, he was definitely not a Thatcherite Conservative. He was not into market liberalism and individualism. He was very much into, well, he was actually philosophically Hegelian. So he was into this idea of a kind of transcendental identity that it was the job of the Conservative to conserve. And this was an identity that was parochial, specific, localized, rooted, and the like. And that's a kind of conservatism which is actually quite unusual in the Anglo-Saxon world, the English-speaking world, but is actually quite common on the continent. It's very much a kind of Germanic or French style of conservatism, one that has been in, under a bit of a shade since 1945, because so many people from that tradition disgraced themselves by collaborating with fascism during the interwar years and World War II. But it's undoubtedly, seeing a resurgence at the moment. And as I say, it's the conservatism. If you want to be more, go back even further, it's the conservative as Bismarck or people of that sort. It's strongly conservative politics, but it's one that believes in a strong, powerful state, a state that acts to maintain and sustain a national interest and power and identity. And that's a kind of politics which, from my point of view, is the worst possible kind of politics. These guys are wrong about everything, basically. And so it's what I completely reject, but it's making considerable gains at the moment. And it's doing this because of the kind of tone deafness, I think, of too many liberals, but also the socialist left, both of whom I think are not aware enough of the very powerful popular sentiment that there is building up, I think, in around these kinds of issues.
I wanted to get your take also just a little bit on, I guess, another idea in Austrian economics that maybe we don't often enough talk about, is just the basic idea of saving and not living beyond your means, sort of long-term thinking and long-term planning for your life. You've touched on the different clubs' finances. I mean, I think this, in a way, the Super League move has shown us just how broke a lot of clubs are, especially after the pandemic. And the one that jumps into my head is Spurs with their new stadium. And I think Levy, I think in a way, signing up to the Super League, getting bankrolled by JP Morgan meant he could pay off Jose Mourinho's contract for however long he needed to. He didn't have to worry about that.
Yes.
So just your take on, I guess, debt and how one should conduct oneself. I mean, now after this whole thing, I can already see in the next 2-3 weeks, it obviously won't fade immediately, but there's going to be focus shifting towards transfers. I mean, City fans, a lot of us are going to talk about the club needs to sign Haaland, maybe Messi as well, if we can somehow wangle that. So it's not to say that fans aren't also part of the problem for wanting their clubs to just spend and spend and spend.
Yeah. Well, personally, put this right out here, I don't think we should sign either of those players.
Okay, wait. Okay, before we get into the debt question, then who do we sign then? Harry Kane?
Well, actually, if we were to sign a new player, I would actually like to sign Kylian Mbappe, because I think he fits in better into the style of play. But actually, I mean, the point you make is a serious one, which is living beyond your means. In other words, or to put it in more plain English, living on debt, because that's what we're talking about here. Now, this is where I think football, if you like, is a bit like a canary in a coal mine, really, because one of the things you discover is that there are lots and lots of businesses all around the world now, including not a few that own sports firms, which are essentially debt-driven and debt-funded. And this reflects, I think, a change that's been going on in global capitalist business for 30, 40 years, really, I think, since 1971. Because if you look at the way the capital that's invested in businesses is produced now, there used to be a significant amount of it that came either from reinvested profits or from saved up income, foregone consumption, which of course is the classic Austrian economics Ogon-Bohm-Warburg definition of what capital is. Capital is foregone consumption, which you use to create more roundabout methods of production. So that is what capital used to be mainly. Now, there always was a certain element of debt finance. This has always been part of, particularly high-risk investment. But what has happened since 1971 is that it's become the overwhelmingly predominant form of large-scale investment. Most large-scale investment now is funded by floating and issuing debt of some kind or other. Corporate paper, fixed interest securities of various kinds, various other kinds of financial vehicle and things of that sort. Now this does bring huge benefits because it means that you can use the financial system essentially as a time machine, because what you do is to bring income from the future in order to create the physical assets or processes that will then generate that income in the future. So as I say, it's like a time machine. You're using something that will only manifest itself in the future to actually build the stuff here and now that you need to create it in the future, which is a neat trick. It really is a kind of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps operation. There's two problems with that, though. One of them is that the big one, obviously, is that this comes with interest charges. You have to pay interest on the debt. And this reflects the risk that the investment will actually not generate that future income, that the future income will, in fact, remain forever virtual and not materialize. And so it's all driven by assumptions about what future growth are. And if those assumptions are over-optimistic, as they have been, then suddenly things get rather hairy, and you have a Minsky moment, as everyone seems to call it now, where everybody suddenly realizes that a lot of the debt and credit out there is actually not worth the paper it's printed on or issued on, and it's never going to be redeemed or even serviced in some cases. And so there are high risks in a business model, a form of market capitalism, which is so heavily driven by debt. It's much more susceptible to manias and panics of various kinds than one that depends more upon foregone consumption, redirected profits and things of that sort. Now, why have we got this? Why has it expanded? And I think the data I gave you is the key to this. It goes back to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. Since then, we've had a fundamentally deranged monetary system. Now, at the moment, there's all this talk about modern monetary theory, MMT, Steph Kelton and people like this. And my own take on modern monetary theory is that as a factual description of the monetary system we have got, it's completely correct. That is the world we live in. We do indeed live in a world of total fiat money, charterless money. It is the case that governments don't need to tax anything if they want to. They could just print money to fund their expenditures. The thing is, Stephanie Kelton and the rest think, oh, this is brilliant. My own view is this is a bloody disaster, basically. And I think a lot of what is wrong with the world economy at the moment can be explained by the fact that money has lost its connection to the physical growth of productive activity and services and resources. It's become a completely detached kind of phenomenon, which is created electronically in the form of debt, basically, because that's what the great bulk of the world's money supply now is debt. And this derangement of money is what has led not just football clubs, but all kinds of enterprises now to fund and finance themselves mainly by issuing debt on the never. And you don't have to be, really old-fashioned or even old to think that this is not going to end well. Not least because it's dependent upon increasingly unrealistic assumptions about future growth.
Not directly tied, of course, to our main topic, but I mean, on the subject of government spending and stimulus, when one thinks of massive stimulus, you always inevitably, we tend to think of the US with Biden, of course, pushing now, I think, 1.9 trillion and another stimulus package. In terms of the UK and the government there, do you see any sort of default on the debt or anything like that anytime soon? Has it been that sort of that overblown as I see the US maybe heading at some point?
No, I don't think so. I mean, at the moment, if you look at the ratio of debt to GDP, it's certainly been going up very dramatically and it's currently standing at a very high level. But by historical comparisons, it's still not that high. The two all-time record peaks for British state debt were just after World War II. And actually, the all-time slightly higher peak was in 1819, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when it stood at just under 240% of GDP. That was after 100 years of continuously fighting the French, basically, and winning, of course, but at great cost. And it then took the British state almost 100 years from 1815 through to 1914 to pay down most of that debt. So there's a share of GDP declined steadily throughout the 19th century, partly because GDP was growing, but also because they regularly retired a lot of debt. So historically, it's not at an unprecedentedly high level. And the other thing is that at the moment, of course, that debt can be rolled over or issued at what are almost negative interest rates, ridiculously low interest rates. You have the situation where people with money are quite literally paying governments like the British government to take the money off them, which is absolutely incredible when you think about it. But that's the world we are in at the moment, partly because so much funny money has been created by the central banks and the private banking system over the last 40 to 50 years. And all that money, a lot of it's been used to bid up the value of assets, things like equities, bonds, real estate, and the like. But ultimately, there's only so many things you can spend it on. And so a lot of it is just being parked now in government debt, with the owners of the money paying the government to do this, essentially. Now, what that means is, in the short term, 10 to 12 years, the British government can roll over this debt and even continue to issue large amounts of debt with almost no increase in its actual current outgoings, because it isn't going to have to pay that much more interest on the debt. In real terms, it isn't paying interest on the debt, in fact. And so there's no danger of a default or anything. The same is probably true for the United States, although less so there, because the sheer scale of what we're talking about in the American case is quite significantly higher than the British or any other European state. Now, the problem for the British government is not now. It's going to be about 10 to 15 years down the line, when I imagine that for various reasons, we're likely to see a return to something like more normal interest rates. And at that point, it will become very difficult to roll that debt over anymore. And the other big problem with all states is not so much the funded debt, it's the unfunded liabilities. It's the promises they have made to various people, many people like me, people of my age, to pay them various things, pensions and the like, which are legal undertakings and obligations, which therefore, in any reasonable bookkeeping account, should be entered on the liability side of the account, but they're not, because of the dishonest way that governments keep their books. But that will have to be paid at some point in the future. And so I think we're not anywhere near a default now. And in fact, I think the pressure on the debt is less now than it has been for quite some time. But there will be a reckoning, but it's quite a way off yet, at least in Europe. The United States might be another story, because a lot of the funding they have is predicated on the dollars being the world reserve currency. And that's not a given. People think, oh, it's always going to be the world's reserve currency. Well, that's not necessarily true.
I think South Africa might also be heading in that direction, especially depending on the state of our state-owned enterprises whose debt is just mounting and mounting. And if there's a run on that, then I think a lot of our banks also underwrite a lot of that debt. So it's a bit of a house of cards situation. So maybe we'll be knocking on that European door very soon, those of us who can try and get out. Just in terms of, I guess, final thoughts, I wanted to ask you a bit about the reforms of the European of the Champions League, because I think this has been lost a bit in the noise about the Super League. Because on Monday, UEFA did announce some changes. For example, increasing the number of teams from 32 to 36. This would start in 2024, in the 2024-2025 season. And then there was also an alteration around how the group stages would work. It would be sort of a league table with all the participating teams. And then the games would be played on Thursdays instead of Tuesdays and Wednesdays. I wonder how that would work with the Europa League. But in a nutshell, do you think that sort of move, just increasing the teams a little bit more, tinkering here and there, would alleviate some of the concerns of the big clubs?
Well, it was intended to do that. I mean, all of these changes were brought in, just like other things, including setting up the Champions League itself in the first place, in order to head off the threat that then materialized on Sunday of a breakaway league. That's one of the reasons why UEFA was so hopping mad, because they'd been engaged in discussions with all these 12 chairmen, over the last 12 months about this arrangement, this reform, on the understanding that this would placate them and buy them off, and they'd presumably give them assurances that it had placated them and bought them off. Hence why the UEFA chairman was quoted as saying that in his 20-odd years as a criminal lawyer, he'd never seen people lie as much as people like Ed Woodward and Giovanni Agnelli. So hence they feel betrayed. So this whole thing was brought in order to placate the big clubs, particularly the two Spanish ones and the Serie A ones, not so much Bayern, although they also benefit from it. And it's a complete bodge, basically, because it increases the number of games dramatically. And it is incompatible with the league programs. They basically told the English Premier League they're going to have to reduce the number of teams in the league because they won't be able to combine a full domestic league program of 38 games plus 2 domestic cups with this new European League program, and that means reducing the number of teams in the EPL to 18, and it means probably getting rid of the League Cup, which will be a disaster for the English Football League because the clubs in that get a significant amount of extra income from the League Cup. So I think that in a way, if you were a conspiracy theorist, you might think that the whole ESL fiasco was actually cooked up to distract attention from what is going through, which is a dreadful plan, just not as bad as the ESL in terms of being anti-competitive. But it's not due to come into play for several years yet, it's worth saying. It's worth pointing out. I think it's two full seasons before it's supposed to come into play. And I think it may well be rowed back before then, because I think quite apart from anything else, the players are going to object pretty strenuously to the demands that are being put on them, and quite a few of the national associations as well. But also, the state of several of the teams that this was meant to buy off is so dire now, financially, like clubs like Real Madrid and Barcelona, that I think that even the Spanish government may find it hard to buy the odd training ground to bail them out again. So a lot of the circumstances which led UEFA to propose these changes are probably going to be moot in a year, I suspect. And I would not be at all surprised to see these changes actually stillborn and have them pulled back or significantly altered in one way or another.
Just from a City fan's point of view, because luckily we're both City fans, so I wanted to get your perspective on, Ferran Soriano and Khaldoon. Do you think they should walk?
I actually think that the club should face sanctions. I really do. And it's up to the owner to decide whether or not they have, Khaldoon and Soriano have actually, as the Americans say, screwed the pooch and right. This point. They've certainly shown a very serious lack of judgment, which does not reflect well on them, because it wasn't just Bayern who refused to take part. And as you indicated, Bayern refused, I think, because they knew they wouldn't get this. Under German rules, 51% of the voting power in a club in the Bundesliga is held by the fans, and the fans would not have supported this. But several other teams also refused. PSG did, but also Porto and a few other teams were asked. Basically said, no, thanks, don't want to be part of this. And Florentino Perez himself has come out today and said he thought that right from the start, City were not really enthusiastic. They were not very keen on the idea. Well, they should have followed their instincts. So I think that, they should certainly face some kind of rap. I think on balance, they probably, should stay in post, but under a bit of a cloud. But I would be prepared to take a pretty stiff punishment, like maybe a transfer ban or a points deduction at the start of next season. But what they have done is nothing compared to what Ed Woodward and the people at Liverpool have done, because they have been involved. I mean, there's very strong rumours are that City and Chelsea only found out about this right at the end of last week, whereas on the other hand, the other teams have been in this for 6 to 9 months, planning it all, if not more. And that means that for several months, they've been going into meetings with other people, other chairmen and other senior executives, and lying to them and deceiving them about what their intentions and plans were. Now, that is simply unforgivable. And in a business context, nobody is going to trust you an inch after that. They will have had no personal respect for you anymore. And so I just do not see how the positions of people at other clubs are tenable. I think that Buck at Chelsea and Soriano and Khaldoon at City, they can probably, have to sit on the naughty step for a while, but keep their positions. But I don't think that's possibly true for the people at Arsenal or Liverpool or United. I mean, Ed Woodward has fallen on his sword. We're told it was a pre-arranged retirement, or leaving his post. But personally, colour me doubtful about that. But he's gone. But I think there's going to have to be lots of other people who will leave as well.
Maybe the saddest thing of this whole episode is that we had on the City website a statement by Joel Glazer, so that will forever make me very, very sad. But
to adapt a phrase, a day that will live forever in infamy, as somebody once said.
Yep, so, I agree very much. So I guess let's see now when the next earthquake day happens in European football. The idea isn't going to die. It might have now fizzled out in this form, but it'll come back in a different form.
Well, I think so, except that I think it may have alerted the Americans. I mean, I think that the desperation of clubs like Juventus and Barcelona and Real is actually at such an acute phase. I think it may well be resolved by their financial insolvency. So they may well be looking at having to restructure, and we might actually see a different champion of La Liga and Serie A for a while, which would be all for the good in my view. But I think that, yes, something like this is going to happen. But the people who have this in mind as a marketing model for football, the creation of an American-style global football thing, I think they will now realize that if they are going to do this, and there may well be a market for this, and if there is, go ahead and try it, that they will have to do it by setting up something from scratch, basically, maybe affiliated with or associated with an existing legacy football brand, but ultimately rather different. They were talking about other things like changing the rules. So Florentino Perez was talking about, as I said, the short attention span of young people and how they weren't interested in football and how they would need to change the rules. And he sort of floated the idea, just like off the top of his head, of maybe making it only an hour-long game, divided probably into 4 quarters, or maybe 3 20-minute periods, like an ice hockey game. Now, you can think of all kinds of other changes. I can imagine a product, maybe an outdoor version of futsal, which would have an appeal to a lot of people in a lot of places. 3 20-minute periods, 7 or 9 people in the team, different shaped penalty area, the way they have it in futsal. That might actually be quite attractive to a lot of people. But then, if you're an entrepreneur and that's where that's where you think the market is going, then do it. And what they wanted to do was to do that kind of thing, a global television product, on the back of the success and the legacy value of a lot of established brands. And what they, I think, realize now is that the value of those brands is tied to the support and interest of a body of people, the legacy fans, who are not going to go down the road that they want to go down. So I think that, yes, it will come back, but it will come back in a rather different form, is my take.
If the new Super League gets rid of VAR, I'll be all in favor of it. I'll support that very strongly. So.
Oh yes, indeed.
But yeah, Steve, I think we'll wrap up there. We've covered quite a lot of ground, and I really have to thank you for helping me make sense of all of the Super League noise. And from an economics and social perspective, it's easy to get lost in, I guess, just fan sort of parochialism, tribalism, that kind of thing, instead of seeing the bigger trends, and it helps to put things in context. So thank you very much for coming onto the show.
Thank you.
To the viewers and listeners, thank you as always. We hope you enjoyed this episode, a bit different to the ones we usually do. But of course, we very much always say that economics, politics, you can see all of this stuff in everything around you. And maybe that also indicates just the extent to which the state is just too big. There's too much politics around. And we hope that we can help you identify these trends and make sense of the world around you. That is just not just noise, but actual words and sentences that you can make sense of. Please remember, if you haven't yet to like the video, please share it on your different channels, and also subscribe to the FMF's YouTube channel. We'll have more content for you very, very soon. In the meantime, take care out there, stay safe, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.